Let me say that this issue of rebuilding community became urgently important about 1 year ago when I received a call from Robert Atwell, who is president of the American Council on Education, which represents, as you know, all of the nation's higher learning institutions. Bob said that the executive committee of ACE had just completed an all-day session and that all of the college presidents in attendance had expressed concern about the breakdown of community on their campuses, and what he said was the growing fragmentation and separation, even tribalism, within the institution. And he wondered if the Carnegie Foundation would be willing to do a study of campus life. Well, I must confess to you that at first I was reluctant to get involved. After all, today's campuses are divided not only socially, they're divided academically and administratively as well. And it seemed to me a bit naive to talk about putting the pieces back together. And to be honest with you, I had no simple formulas or easy bromides to suggest. But then, after some soul searching, I concluded that if the spirit of community cannot be sustained on a college campus, if colleges and universities cannot live with some degree of self-discipline and work collegially together, then how in the world do we hope to have civility and community in society at large, where purposes and goals are far less cohesive? And so last year at the Carnegie Foundation, we did launch a year-long study of campus life, focusing on issues that range from alcohol and drug abuse to security and safety, to lack of civility, to a breakdown of communication. And what we found will be of no surprise to those of you assembled in this room. We found that higher education, like all of society, has its problems. And it surely would be foolish to expect colleges to be idealistic, self-protected islands. But we also found tensions and divisions that were eroding, in fact, the quality of campus life. And this afternoon, at the conclusion of this enormously stimulating conference, I should like to focus on 6 principles that I believe are absolutely crucial if the spirit of community is to be vitally sustained, even as we celebrate diversity in higher education. We begin the Carnegie Report by focusing on the mission of the institution, and we say that a college or university must above all be a place of learning. Big surprise. We say that if we hope to strengthen community on campus, we must focus first on the quality of academic life and look at the way faculty and students relate to one another, both in the classroom and beyond. I should confess that when we first started this study, some of my colleagues argued that we should focus on the so-called extracurricular activities only. After all, campus life has to do with life outside the classroom, right? And we should ignore the academic. This had nothing to do with community, or so it was argued by my colleagues. But I also must tell you that as we went from campus to campus, it soon became apparent that the academic and the non-academic cannot be divided. And if students are not intellectually engaged, if there's not a serious community connection at the intellectual core, then all the talk about strengthening the quality of campus life, in my opinion, will be simply a diversion. And yet, is it too harsh a judgment to say that on most campuses today, the academic and the non-academic are, in fact, disturbingly separated from one another? And that very often during our visits, we found that students quite literally live in 2 separate worlds. On the one hand, we have classrooms where faculty and students meet together several hours every week, while outside the classroom, we have counselors and RAs and clinicians who are responsible for the rest of collegiate life. And in this other world, faculty are essentially uninvolved. It's also true that on far too many campuses, teaching simply is not highly prized, and yet it's the connecting tissue by which intellectually and evocatively students are connected. Or to put it as simply as I can, it's through great teaching that community is affirmed. And yet in the faculty culture and the reward system that we've established, when it comes to getting tenure, it's far better for a professor to deliver a paper to colleagues at a convention at the Hyatt in Chicago than to meet with undergraduates back home. And then we wonder why we don't have community on campus. Indeed, in the Carnegie Faculty Survey of several years ago, we found that about 20% of the faculty said their loyalties were to the campus, and about 70% said their loyalty was to the profession. One faculty member said, "My community is the Watts line, not my colleagues down the hall." In the Carnegie report, we conclude that it's not then in the residence hall or in the Rathskeller, but it's in the classroom where the spirit of community must begin, as students and faculty are intellectually and evocatively connected to each other around the central purpose of the community, and that is the teaching and the learning as the process that drives us toward a common goal. We also conclude in our report that it's not the length of time that students spend on campus, it's the quality of the encounter. We have a myth that if you're here full time, community will emerge. Not so. It has to do rather with the interconnections that are established among the people, and often that's beginning with the quality of the classroom itself. Let me say that when we began the study, I had this prejudicial judgment that in spite of their name, community colleges were probably the least communal of all higher learning institutions. And the reason I reached that judgment was that after all, these serve older people who come flitting in and out. I mean, how can they have any community connections? They're only there several times a week. Well, I'll tell you how dead wrong I was. When our site visitors started to come back, the ones who were most excited were the ones who had visited community colleges, and I said, this can't be. But then they started telling me stories about how in the classroom, and I repeat again, how in the classroom older people were inspired by the teachers, and how after class they'd spend time talking to each other, and how the classroom itself became almost an island of reassurance for many older people who were trying to cope in a world where their lives were fragmented. And then in my own life, I saw a 35-year-old daughter who, in mid-career as a single parent, went back to a community college to get a degree that would help her to become economically self-sufficient. And when Beverly would come home in the evening, after a busy day of working, she'd come back renewed, and she established a network of support group among women who were mid-career. And that became a powerful communal reinforcement in her life, and it led me again to the conviction it's not the length of time that a student spends on campus, it's the quality of that encounter, and it begins within the classroom as faculty and students become engaged around the learning process. Let me underscore an absolutely essential point. Nothing I'm saying this afternoon, and nothing I've tried to write for 30 years, is to suggest that research is inconsequential. I'm only trying to argue that scholarship eventually moves from the scholarship of discovery to the scholarship of integration, to the scholarship of application, and finally to the scholarship of teaching, which is the final product of the mind of inquiry at its very best. And so we must celebrate the teaching act as a reaffirmation not only of scholarship, but a connection to the building of a community of learning. And yet this country is in trouble, it seems to me, precisely because we have diminished the excitement and, may I say so, even the sacredness of teaching. Several years ago I couldn't sleep, and instead of counting sheep, I counted all the teachers I'd had. And I must confess there were a few nightmares in the bunch. But then I remembered 15 or more, and I remembered at least 3 or 4 who were absolutely stunning, who profoundly changed my life. I remembered Miss Rice, my first grade teacher. First day of school, she turned to 28, frightened, awestruck, anticipating children, and she said, "Good morning, class. Today we learn to read." Most exciting. We spent all day on 4 words: I go to school. We traced them, and not one child said, "No, not today, let's string beads." I mean, If Miss Rice says you learn to read, you learn to read. So we had this sentence, I go to school. We traced them, we sang them, and God forgive her, we even prayed them. She had worked out a little prayer, thank you, God, I go to school. Incidentally, on that delicate subject, I heard recently that the one prayer in school that's acceptable to all faiths is, dear God, don't let her call on me today. I ran home that night 10 feet tall, and I said proudly to my mother, today I learned to read. I think I hadn't learned to decode, I'd probably learned to memorize, but Miss Rice taught me something much more fundamental. She taught me that language and learning are inextricably connected. And I find it really quite remarkable that 50 years later, when I tried to write a book on college, I had a chapter up front called The Centrality of Language. And yet I have to confess that that was the continued influence of an unheralded first grade teacher, Fairview Avenue Elementary School, Dayton, Ohio, who lives on forever. Great teachers live forever. And I suspect that everyone in the audience today is here because of an inspired teacher. And how do we expect the life of scholarship to be sustained if we diminish the inspiration of those who keep lighting the fires for future generations? I'm suggesting once again that in the end, the challenge of building community in higher education rests not just with the RAs or with the health clinicians or with the deans of students who are expected to sustain community. The building community rests first with faculty in the classroom. And if a college or university is truly committed to renewal, it must give reward and recognition, not just to the processes of the scholarship of research, but to the processes of the scholarship of great teachers who inspire future scholars in the classroom. Robert Oppenheimer, at the 200th anniversary of Columbia University, put it this way. He said that it's the proper role of the scientist that he not merely find a new truth and communicate it to his fellows, but it's also the role of the scientist, Oppenheimer said, that he teach, that he try to bring the most honest and most intelligent account of new knowledge to all who will try to learn, and surely this means inspiring future scholars in the classroom. This brings me to principle number 2. In the Carnegie Report, we conclude that a college or university must be not just a community with an academic purpose, connected in the classroom with teachers and with students, but a community must also be an open and honest place where free speech is uncompromisingly protected, and also a place where civility is powerfully affirmed. The point I'd make here is that in the end, it's not the structure of the institution, it's the quality of discourse that establish the character of the place. Language is the key. It's at the heart of everything we do. Language, the use of symbols, defines who we are and establishes, in a miraculous way, our interconnectedness with each other. I mean, consider the miracle of this moment. I come here. I do not know most of you. I move to the platform and I start vibrating my vocal folds. Molecules are bombarded in your direction. They hit your tympanic membrane. Signals go scurrying up your 8th cranial nerve. And there's a response in your cerebrum that approximates, I trust, the images in mind. But do you realize the audacity of this act? The assumption that somehow we are establishing at this very moment some sense of community among us, ephemeral, passing, but one hopes occasionally enduring. That's all we have. It's simply the connectedness of symbols that I try to stir in your mind that approximates my own. I must say I'm encouraged that you're looking in my direction, but I've been a teacher far too long to confuse visual contact with cerebral interaction. Nonetheless, it's a huge and essential act of faith because it's the only way I know to build connections. It's the only way by which community is stirred and, one hopes, essentially sustained. And if we hope to improve the spirit of community in higher education, I have only one suggestion. We must begin by improving the quality of our communication. But the sad truth is that we live in a world where language is shockingly abused, where slogans have become substitutes for reason. We live in a world of persistent propaganda, where words are used to hurt rather than to heal. And sadly, when I was, again, a boy in Dayton, Ohio, which is the cultural center of the free world, where were you born? But in any event, we used to say, sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me. What nonsense. I'd usually say that with tears running down my cheeks, thinking all the time, hit me with a stone or a stick, but stop the words. Stop the words. It penetrates so deeply. Children, before they ever go to school, know how to use words as weapons of assault. And unhappily, this breakdown of civility is occurring in higher education. And on college campuses, we scurry about so fast, we're so caught up in the thick of thin things, that we fail to speak and listen carefully to each other. Indeed, if you look at the nature of our instruction and what we prize, it's the sending of messages, not receiving them. We teach people how to write and how to speak, but how much time do we teach them how to listen and how to receive and critically assess the messages that they get? And I think one of the most disturbing findings of our study in the past year was what I would call the breakdown of civility on campus. More than 60% of the presidents we surveyed said sexual harassment is a growing problem. About 50% listed racial harassment as a problem. We found shocking examples of racial and ethnic slurs, and when we asked presidents what would improve the quality of campus life, over 80% said better communication among administrators, faculty, and students. Now, these are clearly the exception, not the rule. I can only tell you that if there's any place where abusive language as it relates to the sacredness of another individual must be judged off limits, or it violates the very essence of the nature of community, it's on a college campus. And one example of obscenity, of racial or ethnic slurs, is to undermine, it seems to me, the most sacred expectation of what a community of learning is all about. The presidents had it absolutely right. If we want to improve the quality of campus life, we must look at the quality of communication. We simply must find ways to better talk and speak and communicate with one another. But it seems to me the problem is that the current bureaucratic alignment of the modern complex university almost negates and denies our urgency to communicate about important issues. It's a pyramid hierarchical structure in which the messages tend to go bureaucratically up and down. They tend to handle the process and not the substance of the institution. And what we don't have in the current university is what I guess I call channels for horizontal communication that would allow us to break out of our departmental hierarchical boxes and confront the essential questions of why we're here and what we're trying collectively to accomplish. That's the agenda that's been lost, partly not because we don't care particularly, but even the methods by which messages are sent somehow negate the very nature of what's accepted as a communication. I mean, under the system, how can you even raise the question, why are we doing this in the first place? It is procedurally arranged to keep the system moving without even challenging the question of redirecting the course of the action that we have. So what we don't have then are the proper forums that allow us to deal with larger and transcendent themes. In that regard, just a moment of introspection. I hear a lot of discussions these days about the 1960s, and I remember them. It was the decade when my hair turned from black to white. And I have to tell you, I remember a lot of anger and frustration. Those were the days when I was shouted down and pushed in and out of office, and there was not much civility. There was not good communication. But then there were those moments when we had the teach-ins. There were occasions when we came out of our separate boxes And when we said enough, let's ask the right questions that go to the core, not just of whether we should be in Vietnam, but what are we doing on this campus? And there were fleeting moments when, in my judgment, we had for the first time the university at its best, because we were speaking about the right issues. We were speaking outside of our masks of bureaucratic labels, and we were talking as honestly as we could possibly talk with one another. And regardless of how you feel about the tragic war in the Persian Gulf, I can only tell you that when I watched the Senate discussing that issue, I thought for the first time in 30 years, I've watched the Senate become a forum of authentic discourse, where people came together and talked not just from their heads, but from their hearts as well. One day as I was chancellor of the university in New York, I was asked to speak to the faculty from across the state, just as I started about delivering one of the world's most authentic and inspiring speeches. A group of several hundred students came in and interrupted me, so it was never delivered. They had placards, they were chanting slogans, they grabbed the microphone and demanded that I free a group of students who had been arrested at Buffalo the night before. And for almost an hour we went back and forth, and finally after 60 minutes, speaking of slow learners, I concluded we weren't speaking to each other, that the meeting was in shambles. And then it occurred to me I wasn't talking to students, I was talking to a faceless mob. But you can't talk to mobs. You can only talk to people. And so more out of desperation than inspiration, I left the platform and began talking to a single student. I asked her name. I asked about her family. Soon others joined us, more out of curiosity than reverence. And there was a subdued climate that emerged, and after a while a compromise was reached, and in the process I'd learned to know some most attentive students. I do not believe that every effort to speak authentically about essential issues will lead to either understanding or easy resolution. There are serious differences. I only know, however, that without the forum we haven't even tested the options of better way of legitimately carrying on our work. And so I conclude that one of the most urgent challenges universities confront is to increase civility, raise the quality of discourse, and if I might say so, create more forums in which we can communicate not just about procedures, but about the purposes themselves. I must say at this point that after studying all of the literature and all of the court cases, we conclude that civility cannot be legislatively or regulatorily imposed. I do not believe that we can anticipatorily establish censorship regarding how people express themselves. It violates both the Constitution and the nature of free speech within the academy itself. I do believe, however, that it's through the moral authority of the institution that the guidelines and constraints can be established, in which from the president on down, we say that's an unacceptable way for this institution to carry on its work. Well, here then is my conclusion. In a university community, freedom of expression must be uncompromisingly defended. Offensive language must be vigorously denounced. And above all, building community means viewing language as a sacred trust and understanding that honesty is the obligation we assume when we're empowered with the use of words. Brings me to principle number 3. In the Carnegie Report, we say that a college is not just a purposeful community or an open community, it's also a just community. A place where the dignity of every individual is affirmed and where equality of opportunity is vigorously pursued. Frankly, I know of no issue that's more urgent than affirming human justice, not only on the campus but in the nation. Since in America today there's a deeply disturbing gap between the privileged and the disadvantaged, I think it's an unspeakable disgrace that in this, the richest nation of the world, 1 out of every 4 children is officially classified as poor. The only time in our history where poverty is carried on the backs of little children. It's a disgrace that 1/3 or more of Black and Hispanic students drop out of school before they're handed a diploma. a more urgent problem than winning in the Persian Gulf. And especially disturbing is the fact that when minority students do come to college, they often feel isolated and alone. During our study, many of the college presidents told us that Hispanic, Black, and white students are living in separate enclaves on the campus. They're not even talking to each other. And our survey revealed that at large universities, 68% of the presidents said race relations is a problem, that tribalism is increasing, and we also found growing intolerance toward women, with racist and sexist comments showing up as graffiti, which I've just mentioned, and even printed as black humor on T-shirts. So, the sad truth is that America is a deeply divided nation, and some of those divisions are beginning to penetrate the academy itself. And the question is, to what extent can we be part of the solution, or to what extent do we reinforce the problem? And after some 20 years of working toward integration, we found ways to expand the opportunities of access for minority students. We have not found ways, it seems to me, to strengthen the notion of multicultural understanding. And if we can't heal the racial and ethnic divisions in our culture, I believe the very future of the nation is imperiled. I wish I had an easy answer. I do believe it reflects itself in the kind of forums that we create. And perhaps we need arrangements in which the leaders, the student leaders from the various groups, can go off in smaller seminars themselves and spend several weeks together to begin to discover who they are as human beings and not carry on the masks that represent group culture and opinion. Authentically trying to discover at a deeper level and listening at a deeper level too. And incidentally, I think the curriculum itself has to be confronted. I know the debate between the older view of Western culture and those who argue for the non-Western cultures. I frankly think that once again we're organizing this around an either-or proposition that isn't authentically getting at the question. I mean, when they say, Mr. Bennett, as others said, Western culture needs to be studied to understand our past, I grant that. But I would only add the other side of the equation. Non-Western cultures also must be studied to understand our future. We have to look in both directions. And there are new influences and new cultures that not only have a heritage but are profoundly going to influence the nature of American life and indeed the globe. And we cannot simply be reinforced by the origins of the past. We have to confront the realities of the future. Leads me to principle number 4. In the Carnegie Report, we conclude that a college is not, and university is not just a purposeful community and an open community and a just, it's also a disciplined community. A place where codes of conduct, both academic and social, have been well defined, and where individuals accept their obligation to the group. Now, I know this is the trickiest point of all. It's okay to be in terms of openness and freedom and all the rest, but when you start talking about discipline, you've gone from preaching to, and starting to meddle. Still, I do believe that in any community, it's necessary to strike a balance between first personal freedom and group constraint. It begins in the family and every other connection that we have. How are my interests to be served as related to how our interests are to be served? It cannot be avoided. It has to be agreed to formally or informally or both, but we have to negotiate our way between individual interests and community concerns. As everyone in the room knows, in the 1960s, the notion of in loco parentis was finally abolished. It was during this period that we agreed that colleges were no longer parents. Again, back to the SUNY system. I was heading a university with 64 campuses, 300,000 students, and we had 93,000 dormitory beds for which I was responsible, and the assumption was that they were occupied by at least one student every night. But we were debating intensely to show you how much the world has changed, whether freshmen should be allowed to live off campus. We were debating whether visiting hours should be abolished. And we were debating whether residence halls should go co-ed, in which I found a real tension between one part of my family, which is Puritan ethic, and the other, which is Quaker. In the end, of course, we answered affirmatively to all three. And I must say, looking back, I'm convinced that creating a more open campus was absolutely right. Students, after all, are adults, not children, and most of them know how to balance freedom and responsibility in their daily lives, at least as successfully as their parents. So the problem is, however, and this gets to the nub of my concern in trying to think about community, the problem is that while we abolished in loco parentis as a governance model of campus life, no new theory of governance was established to create it. Colleges knew they were no longer parents, but they remained wholly unclear about just where their authority begins and ends. And that's left most institutions unusually ambivalent about the nature of the civic dimension of campus life. During our study, we found that 2/3 of the presidents rated alcohol and drug abuse a serious problem. Date rape is increasing. 2/3 of the presidents said that crime and vandalism is a growing problem. And the presidents at liberal arts colleges overwhelmingly said that loud noise in the residence hall is a problem, which is one of my pet peeves. I'm hugely offended by those who surround me with what I guess I'd call auditory pollution, that insist on inserting in my consciousness noise that I didn't invite. Even that item, which at one level seems to be rather trivial, raises the question of what I want to listen to versus what they want to listen to. And the same people who wouldn't think of shining a bright light in your eyes endlessly are quite willing to bombard your tympanic membrane endlessly with noise at perhaps 135 decibels when it's turned down. But I raise all that to ask you this question. What in the world is the college to do about all this? I mean, we're not parents. We can't say do this, do that, or we'll kick you out. To what are the arrangements by which we confront what I guess I'd call the civic dimensions of our living together within the community of learning? And incidentally, while colleges think they're not parents, I can only tell you that parents think you're parents. And more than that, the media thinks we're parents. And more than that, the politicians think we're parents. Or to put it another way, they do not allow the university to say, it's not my concern, they're all grown up. Because when there is, in fact, a major crisis on the campus, you know what happens. Everyone arrives in hordes and say, why didn't you do it better? Even though no one quite knows for sure what doing it better really means. I was on a Nightline show with Ted Koppel after the Len Bias incident at the University of Maryland, when a young man who had just come back from having signed $1 million contract, living on an apartment on his own, who was about as free and unattached and uncontrollable by the university as any human being, overdosed. And who was on the grill? Who was called accountable? The Chancellor of the University of Maryland. And I don't know to this day what he might have done. All I know is we have an ambivalence here that hasn't been reconciled between the internal judgments administratively and the social expectations. And to show you the kind of backlash we're experiencing, you all know that last year Congress passed a law that said that every college and university now has to report the crime on campus annually, so students, when they're selecting a college, can give a crime wave index to the institution when they choose. And that became law precisely because of a tragic rape and murder at an East Coast institution in which the parents were so outraged they had to let their agony and pain be revealed in a sense that we're going to try to help future children. I understand that. I only know that we're caught in a terribly difficult dilemma. Now, no one imagines returning to the days when lights were out at 11 o'clock sharp, or when girls' dorms were locked up tighter than a drum, or when deans of students were viewed as parents on the prowl. Still, this is my conclusion, and it's a rather lame and anemic one, I confess, but I do believe that no community can thrive in a climate where conduct is chaotic. And we conclude that educators should be as concerned about non-academic standards as they are about academic life. Let me simply conclude this point by raising this issue. In my opinion, we are not at all timid about establishing the rules and regulations for classwork and graduation. To put it as simply as I can, in the academic world, we're totally parental. Do this, do that, and if there's any deviation, your life is jeopardized in the intellectual life. Outside the intellectual, it's low-grade decadence, as if we don't have a prayer of an understanding. Is it conceivable that we could think of building an integrative code of conduct in which the principles of responsibility on both the academic and the non-academic would be better joined? To say it another way, in most universities, by my standards, we're over-regulated academically and under-regulated. We still teach children or students in the learning life as if they're children, and we're under-regulated in the civic and social life. The challenge between now and the year 2000 is to reopen and renegotiate the issue of what a community of learning is in a discipline sense, in which the academic and the non-academic expectations might be to develop an integrative code of conduct, perhaps an honor system writ large. This brings me to principle number 5. We say in the Carnegie Report that a college is also, hold your breath, because just gotten a shaft because I used this word in the recent New Republic, but here I go again. A college university is, I think, also a caring community. It's a place where the well-being of every member is supported and where service to others is encouraged. Now, at first blush, this term caring seemed soft and almost sentimental. And I have to tell you, we're living in a world in which the word hard is good and the word soft is bad. There's a hard edge to the kind of language in America today. The self-centeredness of I'll get mine and the notion of caring seems to be almost a romantic, non-American way to think about it, and certainly to try to translate that into public policy. I do believe, though, that as human beings, I believe it to the deepest point of my understanding, that we have an absolute need for social bonding from the first to the last moment of our lives. And I also believe that after getting food in our bellies, getting some kind of social connectedness that establishes bonding is really essential for survival itself, at least in a sense of emotional worth. And all the studies, even with primates, show that when young ones are disconnected from a caring other, they begin to shrivel, become emotionally disturbed, and even die. My wife's a certified nurse midwife and delivers babies, including 7 grandchildren of our own. And Kay has convinced me that the bondedness in human experience begins before birth, as the unborn infant monitors the mother's voice. And incidentally, that begins auditorily before birth because the 3 inner ear bones, the hammer and the anvil and the stirrup, the 3 middle ear bones, are the only bones that are fully formed at birth. So we're hearing before we're seeing, before we're breathing, and what babies hear are mothers' voices vibrating in the body, which is amplified by the fluid in the womb, which is a wonderful conductor. So when the baby's born, Kay tells me, the infant will look instinctively when the mother speaks to make a connectedness that's already well established. Bondedness is before we're born, and having just cared for a 90-year-old mother for several years, I know it never ends until the final birth of life. If we do not understand this as an element of community, we have all the rules and regulations, we have the procedures that look nice on paper, we do not have a community of learning. It's not only a place that's disciplined, but I think supportive too. Yet several years ago, when we surveyed 5,000 undergraduates, 50% of them said they feel like a number in a book. About 40% said they don't feel a sense of community, and 2/3 said they have no professors who's interested in their personal lives. I do not mean that everyone should be clinician. I only mean that we should find ways to let people know that in the end it's a human institution too. And incidentally, I talked to a head of a university clinic service at one of the great Midwestern universities who's been there 20 years, and he said he's finding more emotionally rooted problems among the students in the last several years than he's ever seen before, which reminds me to say that our disconnectedness, our lack of caring, really begins long before students come to college. In fact, when we did a study on high school at the Carnegie Foundation several years ago, I concluded we have not just a school problem and a youth problem in this country. Many young people in our largest high schools feel unneeded and unconnected. And I think many of them drop out of school because no one noticed that they had, in fact, dropped in. I also think that there's a growing intergenerational disconnectedness in our culture. Margaret Mead said on one occasion that a healthy culture has 3 generations vitally interacting. We no longer have a vertical connection, we have horizontal connections. We've organized ourselves so that children are in daycare centers, older ones are in school, adults are in the workplace, retirees are institutionalized in retirement villages. You can go from birth to death and talk only to your peers. I mean, an institution where the average age is 3 years old is as unhealthy as an institution where the average age is 80. My mother and father did spend a few years in a retirement home. My father called one day. He was having his 80th birthday. He said, "No big deal being 80 around this place. You have to be 90 just to get a cake." I mean, used to be if you were 80 years old, you were the icon of the family. Now you're at the bottom of the totem pole. You have to wait for that big birthday party in the sky or something. But the nice feature about the place was they had a daycare center there. So that every morning, little 50-year 4- and 5-year-olds came trucking in, and every older person had an adopted grandson, and every little child had an adopted grandparent. So my father, when I'd call him, he wouldn't talk about his aches and pains. He'd talk about his little friend, little 5-year-old, the smartest kid he ever knew, going to be president someday, or at least governor of Iowa. And the nice thing about it was that, incidentally, the point was it was intergenerational connected, and there was a caring that had been established as younger and older came together. I heard recently that the reason grandparents and grandchildren get along so well together is they have a common enemy. But maybe not so nice. Well, run with it if you think it'll help. I'm suggesting that as separate age groups come together, they can learn from one another. And incidentally, it's for that reason that I greatly celebrate the coming back of older students to campus life. But let's not divide them between the olders and the regulars. I mean, older students can bring vitality and wisdom and intercultural connections in classrooms, and anyone who remembers the GI Bill knows exactly what kind of vitality, and bear in mind, higher education fought the GI Bill. But when it happened and we had older people, suddenly we celebrated the fact that they were authentic learners. So I'm suggesting that in the end, caring is the glue that holds everything together. And we recommend in the Carnegie Report that faculty should be rewarded not just for publications, not just for teaching, but frankly for advising, for the time they can authentically engage with students. We also urge a community service project to encourage students to see a connection between what they learn and how they live. Why don't we make service a dimension of college life so that the campus is not seen as an isolated island, but a staging ground for action? And students can start already engaging with the fact that their learning has to somehow be authentically connected to others. Martin Luther King said on one occasion that everyone can be great because everyone can serve. And I'm convinced that the young people of this nation are ready to be inspired by a larger vision. Well, you're keeping track, aren't you? Brings me to my final observation. In the Carnegie Report, number 6, we conclude that a college of quality is a, forgive this word, celebrative community. A place where heritage is remembered and where rituals and traditions are widely shared. In the award-winning Broadway play Fiddler on the Roof, the peasant dairyman who raised 5 daughters with considerable help from scriptural quotations, many of which he himself invented, says that the thing that makes life tolerable to the hard-working Jewish families are the old laws, the old customs, and the feasts that are handed down from one generation to another. Without these, the dairyman declares, life would be as shaky as a fiddler on the roof. So it is with college. While scholars teach and do research and while students study on their own, I think a community of learning in the end is held together by something more than a common grievance over parking. That is, what do we have to celebrate together? And the truth is that most of the issues that join institutions have to do with the grievances that irritate us and not by the commitments that inspire. In fact, I read recently that neighborhoods in America have collapsed. There are no joining around common caring. The only way you can get neighborhoods to come together is through a zoning law that might somehow reduce the economic power of their property. Now you see a community but it's a community based on exclusion and rejection, not on integration and celebration. So I simply do believe that colleges need to have a sense of their own uniqueness. They're feeling that they're somehow unabashedly distinctive, that they not only have a past to remember, but a future to celebrate as well. That's why we have commencements. That's why we should have opening convocations. That's why the students at this place should be celebrated for 25 years of an institute that tries to create a form of tradition. And incidentally, it's this the reason that we can celebrate George Washington Carver, not to remember the past, but to ask, what's the implication of having an African American come here in terms of the changing face of America 100 years from now? So the remembering of the past is only a springboard as a challenge to redefine the future. Lewis Thomas wrote on one occasion that if this century doesn't slip forever through our fingers, it will be because learning will have directed us away from our splintered dumbness and helped us focus on our common goals. And this, it seems to me, is what a celebrative community is all about. One that celebrates diversity, but celebrates the integration of our common ends. Here then is my conclusion. To strengthen the quality of campus life, we don't need more rules and regulations. We need a larger, more inspired vision. We need colleges and universities that are purposeful, that are honest, that are disciplined, that are just, that are caring. We need institutions that celebrate their tradition. And I ask, in this hard-bitten world, is it possible to imagine a community such as this? Thank you very much. I've been advised that we have no more than 10 minutes or so, and some of you have to leave promptly. I understand that. If you'd like to stay for 5 or 10 minutes to get a few responses to questions, I'll surely be willing to do that. Yes, please.